What happens after death according to the Bible? It's not what you think. You have likely stood at a bedside, watched a life slip away, or sat through a funeral service and felt the same uncomfortable tug. Certainty about what comes next is thinner than you were taught. That moment, when answers fail and images from sermons, movies, and family lore collide, exposes a deeper problem. Contemporary conversations about death are noisy and contradictory. People draw from scripture fragments, popular culture, and distant traditions, stitching together an afterlife that feels coherent only because we rarely test its seams. This script begins in that tension, between the emotional urgency of personal grief and the patchwork of ideas we inherit about what happens after death. The urgency is practical as much as existential. Beliefs about the afterlife shape how we grieve, how communities care for the dying, and even how societies legislate end-of-life matters. Yet many of those beliefs rest on images that circulate unexamined. Some come from literal readings of isolated verses, others from centuries of church tradition that have accreted around a few central doctrines. Outside Christianity, rival traditions offer different maps of what follows, and within Christianity there is no single, uncontested map. The landscape is fragmented, and that fragmentation has consequences, for pastoral care, for interfaith respect, and for anyone trying to answer the simple question a child will ask: what happens when we die? This project takes a deliberate approach. It does not arrive with a sermon or a fantasy. Instead, it aims to treat the Bible as a historical and literary corpus, to listen to the voices of different religions with attention, and to examine how Christian traditions have interpreted texts across centuries. The goal is not to overturn faith or to provide a definitive metaphysical blueprint, but to clarify what key sources actually say, to separate cultural overlay from textual claims, and to show why the standard pictures many of us hold may mislead us. Along the way, you will encounter surprising tensions within Scripture, divergent interpretations among Christian communities, and contrasts with other religious systems that have shaped human hope for millennia. This journey is intended for anyone who has ever felt uneasy about the neat answers offered in casual conversation or at the back of a church bulletin, seekers, doubters, clergy, and the curious who want to reconcile faith with honest questions. It respects the emotional weight of the subject while insisting that clarity matters. When we misread foundational texts or allow popular culture to harden into doctrine, our responses to loss and our moral choices can be distorted. Recognizing that will not erase pain, but it will change how we prepare for death, how we comfort one another, and how we live now. In the sections that follow, we will trace patterns across Scripture and tradition, examine influential interpretations, and consider how different faith frameworks answer the same basic human questions. We will look at language, historical context, and the ways communities have preserved or altered meanings over centuries. You will be invited to reassess familiar images and to consider alternatives that may be less sensational but more consistent with the sources themselves. This is a careful, sometimes unsettling exploration intended to replace muddled certainty with informed conviction, and to open space for questions you may not have known how to ask. Think of the beliefs about life after death as recipes that traveled across borders, picked up new ingredients, and were served under different names. In the centuries before Christianity became organized theology, communities in Judea, Alexandria, and Athens sampled one another's ideas. This mingling altered technical terms and everyday expectations alike, so when early Christian writers used familiar words, those words carried blended meanings that later generations treated as fixed. Now, consider how that linguistic and cultural fusion reshaped the language people used to describe the dead. In much of pre-exilic and early Second Temple Jewish literature, death was framed less as a change of residence and more as a diminished form of existence. The common term described a shadowed state disconnected from the living. When Greek-speaking Jewish scholars translated Hebrew scriptures into the language of Hellenistic culture, they selected a Greek counterpart that already had its own philosophical baggage. That single lexical choice introduced distinctions that were not present in the original and nudged readers toward concepts of the underworld familiar to Greek audiences. Imagine a translator choosing a culinary substitute. The dish looks similar, but the flavor shifts in a way that future cooks assume was always intended. Political and sectarian debates inside Judaism also shaped later Christian formulations. One influential group emphasized an eschatological reversal, a bodily renewal tied to divine vindication, while another denied any post-mortem restoration. These internal disputes show that ideas about death were contested long before they were doctrinal. Picture two legal advocates in a courthouse arguing whether identity persists after a verdict. Their positions framed how witnesses read prophetic texts and how congregations prayed at gravesides. That courtroom atmosphere left fingerprints on the writings that circulated among early followers of Jesus. At the same time, philosophical schools circulating through the Mediterranean offered alternative models. Some taught that identity depended on an immortal principle that escapes the body, others held that the whole person is corporeal and perishes. As Christianity expanded, thinkers who had grown up with these philosophies sought to articulate faith commitments in terms intelligible to their neighbors. The result was a hybrid vocabulary in theological treatises and sermons, one that mixed juridical metaphors, mystical visions, and metaphysical categories. Consider a village catechesis where an orator explains salvation using metaphors stolen from marketplace contracts and Stoic ethics. People absorb a mixed message that later solidifies into routine belief. Manifestations of these convergences appear in a variety of primary materials: liturgical prayers that assume an intermediate presence, martyr narratives depicting immediate vision, and pastoral letters counseling families about burial rites. Those texts, circulated and recopied over generations, created clusters of expectation. For many communities, the lived practice, how bodies were prepared, what prayers were said, which days were observed, mattered more than abstract definitions. In other words, ritual habits often entrenched a theological understanding faster than scholarly debate did. Reflect for a moment on how modern misconceptions can arise from a handful of historical accidents: a translation choice, a philosophical preference, a disputed synagogue ruling, or a popular prayer that captures the public imagination. When you encounter a confident claim about what happens after death, ask whether it rests on a layered history of borrowing and interpretation. Such scrutiny does not aim to undermine faith, rather, it illuminates how doctrines evolved and helps you recognize which elements are inherited customs and which are explicit commitments of early texts. The next layer to examine centers on how influential theologians framed the question, and how their arguments left fingerprints on subsequent teaching. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, thinkers with widely different aims offered durable models. One argued for ultimate restoration and an ordering of souls that would culminate in universal reconciliation, another insisted on an immortal principle subject to eternal reward or punishment. Centuries later, a medieval scholar reconciled philosophical categories with doctrinal claims in a way that made bodily resurrection intelligible within an Aristotelian framework. Each of these approaches supplied a conceptual toolkit, distinct metaphors, legal metaphors, metaphysical categories, that would be recycled by pastors, hymn writers, and courtroom-style sermons for a millennium. The result was not a single map but competing maps that shared overlapping roads. Different branches of Christianity then institutionalized these options. The Western tradition formalized rites and taught an interim purification process in which the soul is prepared for full communion. The Eastern tradition shaped its own language around union with the divine life, treating post-mortem reality as part of an ongoing healing rather than a narrowly forensic settlement. Protestant reformers reacted against both the language and the practices they found objectionable, while simultaneously retaining earlier emphases on final bodily transformation. Later movements introduced alternatives: a body and soul sleep until a final awakening, or the idea that the unrighteous simply cease to exist rather than suffer perpetually. These positions are not trivial footnotes. They change how communities pray, which hymns get sung at gravesides, and what funerary art looks like. Scripture itself contains material that theologians have pulled in different directions, and the tension between these passages explains why interpretation matters. One New Testament writer stresses a transformed, imperishable body that will appear at the end of the age. Elsewhere another voice speaks of immediate presence with the divine upon departure from the physical frame. A parable paints a vivid, almost courtroom scene where fortunes are reversed and consciousness after death is depicted with sharp details. Prophetic and apocalyptic texts, by contrast, emphasize a climactic restoration tied to cosmic renewal. Because the sources push in different directions, exegetes have not merely debated facts but debated hermeneutical priorities, which texts set the agenda for doctrine, and which should be read as metaphor or pastoral consolation. Consider a concrete, modern example. A family in a Midwestern town once requested a funeral homily focused exclusively on an imminent heavenly reunion. The pastor, trained in a tradition that emphasizes intermediate presence, complied. A cousin from another denomination left the service convinced that the deceased had merely entered a waiting sleep. Years later these relatives argue bitterly over memorial plaques and cemetery placement because their underlying pictures of death required different rituals. That dispute is small-scale but illustrative. Divergent doctrinal choices translate into different grief practices, legal requests in wills, and even divergent expectations when planning end-of-life care. Look also at how these competing pictures shape larger ethical stances. When a community emphasizes a future, bodily renewal, its social imagination may tilt toward long-term stewardship of creation and a rehabilitative stance toward suffering. Where immediate heavenly presence dominates, rhetoric can drift toward consolation that places the ultimate prize beyond this world. Those commitments, taken together, influence preaching priorities, charitable investment, and how faith communities articulate hope to the vulnerable. If you find yourself sorting these options, note that the differences run deeper than vocabulary. They reflect distinct visions of what humanity is for and how justice will be enacted beyond death. Stories have long acted as the scaffolding of belief, arranging raw ideas into scenes your imagination can step into. Ancient Egyptians painted corridors of judgment and spells on papyrus so that the living could rehearse the dead's journey. Those paintings were not mere decoration but practical scripts for how people expected the next world to behave. At the other end of the ancient spectrum, a Mesopotamian epic described a shadowy afterlife with blunt finality, setting a tone of resignation rather than anticipation. These narrative blueprints supplied concrete motifs, gates, ferrymen, thresholds, that later artists and preachers borrowed and reworked into familiar stage sets for the human passage beyond life. Now, consider how those inherited props still shape what we picture when we imagine the beyond. Dante's imagination deserves special attention because his poem converted abstract theology into a cinematic route, spirals of descent, terraces of ascent, rivers that separate realms. Generations that could not read dense doctrinal disputation nevertheless absorbed Dante's architecture through carvings, stained glass, and roadside tableaus that echoed his spatial logic. As a result, many ordinary believers carry spatial metaphors, depths, ladders, levels, when they talk about the fate of the dead, even if their clergy speak in different idioms. Picture a parish church whose carved tympanum matches a poem's landscape. The congregation learns geography as theology without ever opening a commentary. Turning to non-Christian ritual literature reveals equally powerful narrative technologies. Tibetan texts provide step-by-step instructions intended to be read aloud as someone dies, coaching the consciousness through encounters with luminous and terrifying appearances. The manual itself becomes both map and companion. Ancient Egyptian funerary manuals functioned similarly, supplying words and images intended to be performed inside a tomb. These genres treat the afterlife as something one can negotiate by recognizing particular signs and responding correctly. If you listen to these texts as practical guides rather than allegory, the afterlife is less a mystery and more a sequence of recognitions and choices. Contemporary creators have repurposed religious symbols with even greater speed. A recent film offered an intensely personalized hereafter governed by memory and art, while a serialized television comedy converted moral philosophy into a workplace satire set in a bureaucratic afterlife. These cultural products do more than entertain, they lower barriers to complex theological motifs by translating them into plot mechanics and character arcs. The result is that people often assimilate theological content through plotlines and emotional beats rather than through theological argument. When you watch a dramatized afterlife, your emotional response to a character's reunion or judgment can eclipse engagement with doctrinal nuance. Practical consequences follow when narratives are treated as manuals. Funeral directors, memorial designers, and digital entrepreneurs have adapted to demand for tailored commemorations, virtual cemeteries, interactive memorial websites, and AI-based simulations that reproduce a deceased person's speech patterns. In these arenas, storytelling becomes a service industry that monetizes particular images of continuing presence or personalized post-mortem identity. This commercialization shapes expectations. What people request at memorials or in advance directives increasingly mirrors the plots they have consumed rather than ancient theological texts. All of this suggests a responsibility shared by creators and consumers. Writers, filmmakers, and ritual specialists decide which motifs to foreground and which to omit. Listeners and viewers choose which fictional tours to internalize. If you find a movie or a hymn that offers a compelling picture of what lies ahead, pause and ask whether its power comes from narrative craft or from grounded tradition. Your mental image of the afterlife is not simply discovered, it is produced, rehearsed, and circulated, and recognizing that opens a different kind of freedom to choose the stories that will comfort, guide, and shape the life you still have. Imagine the cultural compass inside which people orient themselves toward death being recalibrated by technologies and clinical practices rather than by sermons alone. In recent decades, developments in critical care, imaging, and life-sustaining machinery have created practical questions that push theological language into operating rooms and intensive care corridors. These encounters force communities to translate abstract convictions about mortality into choices about ventilators, feeding tubes, and do not resuscitate orders. Picture belief systems being retrofitted to new equipment. The shape of faith bends when it must answer whether to withdraw support or transfer care to a hospice team. Scientific inquiry into consciousness near the end of life introduces another layer of complexity. Observations of patients who report vivid experiences while clinically close to death, or instances of residual neural activity that outlast outward signs of life, have prompted clinicians and families to rethink assumptions about immediate cessation. At the same time, the data are messy and nuanced, physiological markers can mislead, and subjective reports resist neat classification. Consider a case where a family holds hope because of a transient EEG pattern, only to learn that the signal did not predict recovery. When you confront such moments, the ethical and pastoral demands are immediate. How do you counsel loved ones when scientific ambiguity collides with religious hope? The rise of palliative care and hospice has reshaped how rituals are staged and where passage is witnessed. More people now die in settings designed around comfort and presence rather than maximal intervention, and that shift changes which gestures acquire meaning. Instead of a hurried bedside prayer in a sterile emergency bay, families often make time for tactile farewells, music playlists that echo a life, and intentional storytelling circles that consolidate memories. A pastor who completed a short residency in palliative communication once reported that learning to hold silence transformed congregational ministries. The minister found that offering guided silence beside a dying person proved more theologically resonant than any hastily delivered promise. If you are planning for the end of life, notice how the available care environment will shape the rites you and your community consider essential. Practical ethics around bodily disposition have been reframed in light of modern options. Treatments such as organ transplantation, body donation for research, and environmentally minded burial techniques prompt religious communities to revisit older presuppositions about the body's inviolability. Some faith leaders have begun to articulate donation as a final act of neighbor love, reframing the theological language so congregants see tissued gifts as continuations of moral responsibility. In contrast, other communities emphasize bodily integrity and resist practices that interrupt traditional interment. When faced with making decisions about post-mortem uses of tissue, ask how your convictions map onto present-day possibilities and what kind of moral imagination your tradition encourages. Psychological models of mourning have influenced pastoral care in ways that alter memorial decisions. Therapies that focus on meaning reconstruction and sustaining ongoing relational bonds encourage commemorations that keep the deceased integrated into everyday life, anniversary rituals, narrative archives, and symbolic acts of care. A mid-sized church implemented a bereavement program that taught lay members simple counseling techniques. Participants reported that structured memory-sharing nights decreased social isolation and changed what families wanted from funerals: fewer formal words, more opportunities for personal testimony. If you are part of a congregation, consider investing in bereavement training that equips volunteers to navigate these therapeutic approaches without displacing theological counsel. Finally, pluralistic societies have pushed religious leaders to engage cross-disciplinary expertise, from ethics committees to palliative specialists, as interlocutors rather than adversaries. Clergy now routinely serve on hospital advisory boards, write advance care documents with chaplain input, and collaborate with secular therapists in grief groups. This practical integration requires new competencies and, for many traditions, a willingness to let medical realities inform pastoral practice without surrendering core convictions. Now, consider how this applies when you face choices about end-of-life care. Who will advise you? Which experts will shape your decisions? And how will your faith tradition translate its deepest commitments into the practical language of modern medicine? Consider how civil law and public policy act like invisible stage directions. They don't write the play, but they shape which scenes are possible and how actors move across the set. When jurisdictions craft statutes about end-of-life choices, burial rites, or the recognition of death, they create legal realities that religious communities must either accommodate or oppose. This dynamic forces faith leaders to translate theological convictions into terms that hold up under statutes and court scrutiny, often asking them to defend sacred assumptions in secular language. Take the debate around medically assisted dying. In places where the practice is lawful, clergy find themselves navigating a narrow corridor between pastoral presence and legal restriction. Ministers may be asked to counsel individuals considering the option, yet institutional policies sometimes forbid clergy from being present during the procedure. Such settings produce wrenching pastoral dilemmas, whether to offer accompaniment in ways that comply with law while still honoring a congregation's moral framework. A pastoral team in a small city learned to draft a standard counseling protocol that distinguishes accompaniment from facilitation, creating boundaries that protect staff conscience without abandoning the person at the bedside. On a different front, regulatory decisions about cemeteries, memorial parks, and the use of public land for burials exert a subtler influence on belief. Zoning rules determine where communities can inter their dead and therefore which rituals become common. When urban councils restrict new cemetery space, families adapt by adopting communal mausoleums or by favoring commemorative walls, and over time those architectural choices alter how bereavement is practiced and remembered. Legal permission to place certain symbols on municipal property also matters. Battles over religious emblems at state-run memorials do more than settle aesthetics, they signal which communal narratives receive official endorsement. The law's definition of death introduces another layer of consequence. Statutes that codify brain-based criteria, or provisions for declaring missing persons legally dead after long absences, have ripple effects in ecclesial life. Sacramental practice, remarriage regulations, and the administration of estates all hinge on formal declarations. A couple I spoke with spent years in legal limbo after a seafaring accident, when the state eventually issued a presumption of death, the Church had to reconcile canonical rules about mourning periods with pastoral sensitivity to the survivor's years of unresolved hope. Legal timelines often force theological decisions into compressed time frames, leaving little space for gradual discernment. Labor law and institutional accreditation also shape religious involvement in death-related services. Hospitals, hospices, and care facilities adopt policies that determine whether chaplains can participate in certain procedures or whether staff may refuse duties on conscientious grounds. Professional credentialing bodies increasingly require clergy to have competency in legal compliance and documentation, turning pastoral formation into hybrid training that blends liturgy with paperwork. In practice, this changes who ministers are and how they minister. Theological formation now routinely includes instruction on consent forms, mandated reporting, and institutional ethics. Finally, civic commemorations and public education form a background rhythm that conditions popular imagination. Veteran ceremonies, civic memorials for tragedies, and school curricula about mortality contribute civic language about death that often eclipses narrower doctrinal language. When a town adopts an annual remembrance that foregrounds civic sacrifice rather than spiritual destiny, its residents gradually inherit a civic theology, values and habits about commemoration, that overlays denominational teaching. Now, consider how this applies when you face choices about civic participation in mourning. Which public rituals will you support, and how will they interact with the beliefs you want to pass on? Civil statutes often decide who speaks for the dead long after the last prayer is spoken, and those determinations can collide with religious customs about kinship and ritual authority. For example, ordinary rules about intestate succession may vest control of a body or funeral decisions in a legally designated next of kin who would not traditionally perform those roles under a community's norms. Imagine a diaspora family whose customary practice assigns ritual leadership to an unmarried sister, yet a state's default gives authority to a surviving spouse. That mismatch produces more than procedural friction, it reshapes who gets to narrate a life and which rights will be honored. Employment protections for mourning are another area where statute shapes spiritual practice. In jurisdictions with limited compassionate leave, workers face impossible choices between maintaining income and observing rites that require travel or multi-day gatherings. A schoolteacher forced to miss an observance overseas because unpaid leave would jeopardize a mortgage illustrates how labor rules indirectly truncate communal grieving. Conversely, places that mandate paid bereavement or religious leave allow time for ceremonial continuity, making law a tool for preserving liturgical rhythms. Emerging questions about reproductive material stored before death create novel intersections between family law and sacred understandings of parenthood. Courts have been asked to rule whether embryos may be implanted after a partner's death, whether a decedent's consent must be explicit, and how resulting children fit into inheritance schemes. These disputes compel religious communities to clarify teachings about posthumous lineage and to advise adherents to record intentions with legal documents so beliefs about the sanctity of family life carry force beyond the grave. When large numbers of deaths occur suddenly, administrative processes designed for ordinary time strain and produce consequential policy choices. Authorities must register deaths, allocate temporary storage, and authorize dispersal. In the rush, paperwork become gatekeepers to ritual. Families who lack proper documentation may be blocked from reclaiming remains, and regulators create expedited procedures that can either facilitate or impede traditional ceremonies. Advocacy groups have used litigation to press for emergency rules that respect faith practices, demonstrating how legal pressure points can preserve ritual integrity under stress. How the state disposes of unclaimed or indigent decedents also reflects moral priorities encoded in law. Municipal programs that provide anonymous burials by default erase personal and communal memory unless policies allow for religious affiliation requests or community sponsorship. Grassroots coalitions in several counties successfully negotiated protocols requiring notification and a temporary hold period so faith groups could intervene, showing that administrative rules are malleable when communities mobilize. Cross-border legal mechanics determine whether remains can travel home, and those mechanics are routinely bureaucratic and costly. Consular clearance, death certificates issued in a foreign language, and embargoes on transport mean that many families either abandon traditional repatriation or shoulder financial burdens to honor them. Non-profit intermediaries increasingly fill that gap by navigating export permits and coordinating with religious authorities abroad. Their existence proves that law can be bridged by organized civic effort. Finally, the funeral industry's regulatory environment affects accessibility and transparency. Consumer protection laws requiring escrow for prepaid packages, public price lists, and licensing of embalmers arose after widespread malfeasance. They reshape what rituals are possible by influencing affordability and vendor behavior. When regulations fail or are absent, markets tend to produce both exploitative practices and inventive workarounds, so legislative design matters for how communities can observe their rights without being preyed upon. Now, think about how these legal instruments will shape your own plans, who will have authority to arrange rights, how employment rules might constrain attendance, whether stored reproductive material will be treated in ways consistent with your convictions, and what contingencies your community should expect if a crisis overwhelms ordinary processes. Digital footprints increasingly outlive bodies, and legal systems are scrambling to decide whether online profiles, cloud archives, and encrypted wallets are property, speech, or something else entirely. Platform operators set their own rules for memorialization, but courts are occasionally asked to override those private contracts when family members demand access to messages or photographs locked behind passwords. Picture a sibling barred from a deceased loved one's photo account because the service treats credentials as strictly private. Litigation can drag on for months, delaying memorial plans and fracturing families. If you store crucial documents or sentimental media online, this area of law will directly affect who can preserve your story. Beyond social networks, the rise of decentralized finance has exposed a practical vulnerability. Keys to cryptocurrency can disappear with a single unbacked device, rendering substantial assets irretrievable. Executors confronted with cold wallets often face a binary outcome: access granted or value lost forever, because courts rarely have a technical remedy for a missing private key. Consider drafting instructions that treat digital keys like deeds, record their location in a secure, legally recognized instrument. Doing so prevents an executor from needing forensic hacking or court orders that may never succeed. Medical legal procedures add another layer where statute shapes ritual timing. When sudden deaths trigger criminal inquiries, coroners and prosecutors may mandate retention of remains for autopsy or toxicology, postponing interment for investigative purposes. Families in such cases navigate a dual system: legal evidence preservation and communal expectations for burial. Courts sometimes arbitrate disputes over release of remains for funeral rites, a process that can become a prolonged negotiation between investigators and kin. Planning for potential forensic holds can save loved ones from additional trauma. Museums and research institutions have accumulated human remains that communities now demand back, invoking laws that recognize collective cultural rights rather than individual ownership. Repatriation statutes and international agreements compel institutions to reconsider possession of ancestral bones, funerary objects, and burial lot artifacts. When courts enforce repatriation, ritual practices long interrupted are revitalized. When they refuse, ancestral communities pursue political and legal strategies to reclaim dignity. If your tradition includes sacred objects or ancestral claims, pay attention to how cultural property law may enable restoration of ritual life. Land use regulation governs more than development; it shapes whether a community can maintain burial grounds across generations. Some municipalities permit reselling or reusing plots after long intervals, while others protect consecrated ground as perpetual. Environmental statutes add complexity: soil contamination rules, water table protections, and public health codes constrain innovative practices such as natural burial preserves or aquamation. Activists fighting to preserve a historic graveyard have learned that zoning appeals and environmental impact statements are now essential tools in defending sacred terrain. Estate planning norms also determine how memory is institutionalized. Trust instruments can fund perpetual memorials, endow clergy salaries, or create scholarship funds that keep a person's values alive. Tax law influences these choices. Certain arrangements maximize charitable deductions and minimize estate tax exposure, while others leave families exposed to unexpected liabilities. When you craft a legacy, consult advisors who understand both fiscal mechanics and the ritual importance of lasting commemoration so that legal form supports, rather than undermines, spiritual intent. Finally, transnational conflicts and migration convert funerary law into a human rights arena. States sometimes restrict repatriation of remains during diplomatic crises or public health emergencies, prompting appeals to international bodies or reliance on consular intervention. Refugee communities, in particular, may face barriers that deprive them of closure and impede culturally mandated mourning. If you or your community anticipates cross-border burials, document permissions and engage diplomatic channels early. Legal preparation can be the difference between a private, lawful burial and an unresolved grievance that fuels long-term sorrow. Death certificates are more than bureaucratic forms, they are legal keys that unlock income streams, benefits, and entitlements. The precise entry chosen by a registrar, whether a cause is recorded as an occupational accident or as an underlying disease, can determine whether a family receives workers' compensation, life insurance proceeds, or survivor annuities. Beyond that, the date and place of death recorded on that document often set the clock for when pensions commence and when tax liabilities crystallize. Now, consider how this applies when you face decisions about where a death is registered. A small clerical choice can ripple into months of financial uncertainty for dependents. Insurance underwriters respond to statutory definitions with fine-tooth scrutiny, and disputes frequently end up in arbitration or court. Policies sometimes contain clauses triggered by very specific legal findings, such as death occurring in the line of duty or as a result of criminal activity. Disagreements about those predicates lead to protracted litigation that delays memorial plans and strains relationships. Imagine relatives forced to file suit to obtain a modest payout because a carrier contests whether a fatal event met a narrowly defined contractual exception. The litigation itself becomes a form of secondary burial, prolonging the administrative aspect of mourning. Health data privacy after death raises distinct legal questions that affect both families and researchers. Medical privacy laws create pathways for designated representatives to access records, yet states differ on how readily those pathways open once a patient is deceased. Clinical documentation can be decisive in malpractice claims, inquests, and epidemiological studies. Access, or the denial of it, changes what narratives can be legally established about the final days of a life. If you are advising a loved one, record explicit permissions while they are competent so decisions later do not hinge on contested interpretations. Genetic information has become a new frontier of post-mortem legal entanglement. Consumer DNA databases have been instrumental in identifying unidentified remains, reuniting families, and revisiting cold cases. At the same time, relatives discover unexpectedly revealing family relationships and hereditary risks when a decedent sample is sequenced for probate or research. Legal frameworks lag behind technology. Statutes rarely anticipate scenarios where a dead person's genome triggers obligations for living kin, such as notification of actionable medical findings or liability in paternity disputes. Think ahead, specify desires about posthumous genetic testing in legal directives to avoid surprise consequences for descendants. Religious liberty claims increasingly appear in litigation involving funeral businesses, cemeteries, and municipal regulations. Courts must weigh free exercise protections against anti-discrimination principles when service providers refuse certain rites or symbolic displays. Those cases shape who may lawfully perform ceremonies and what accommodations local governments must permit. For communities planning rites that fall outside mainstream practices, legal counsel can be essential to safeguarding access to officiants and spaces without sparking adversarial proceedings. Public rituals orchestrated by governments play a formative role in collective mourning and in the legal recognition of legacy. Protocols for state funerals, official commemorations, and the burial of public servants articulate a nation's priorities and create legal categories of honor that affect access to certain cemeteries and memorial funds. When a public institution decides to grant a posthumous distinction, that decision carries tangible consequences: entitlements for families, placement in protected grounds, and inclusion in historical registers. If you are part of a group seeking civic recognition for a member, understanding the legal channels is as important as the ceremonial script. Demographic trends reshape the legal landscape in subtle but powerful ways. Aging populations create pressure on guardianship systems, change the prevalence of contested wills, and increase reliance on proxy decision-makers whose authority is established by statute. Simultaneously, urban density drives interest in municipal death care cooperatives and shared memorial spaces that require new zoning categories and cooperative governance documents. When planning community-based solutions, invest time in crafting bylaws and regulatory strategies so the legal structure supports long-term ritual continuity rather than dissolving under administrative stress. Think of family life as the primary laboratory where afterlife images are tested and refined long before anyone hears a sermon. In that domestic lab, small habitual acts, the bedtime blessing, a Sunday dinner prayer, a grandmother's way of describing a departed relative, instantiate metaphors that children carry into adulthood. Now, consider how this applies when you talk with young people in your circle. The casual language you choose will likely outlive formal instruction and become the default script they call upon in moments of grief. Psychological research into early cognitive frames shows that young minds prefer concrete narratives over abstract argument. Metaphors that invoke familiar spaces or routines stick because they map onto lived experience. Parents who describe death using familiar routines, saying someone went to the other house or joined the family upstairs, offer a cognitive map that reduces anxiety but also narrows future theological imagination. A neighbor who told her child that a lost pet took a long nap in the garden created a comforting image. Years later, that child resisted more complex theological explanations because the household story had already fixed the emotional meaning. The physical objects kept in homes play an outsized role in shaping expectations. Memory boxes, heirloom jewelry worn at meals, a corner with stacked albums and a single lit lamp, all of these material cues teach a practice of ongoing relation rather than abrupt separation. In many migrant households, an ordinary kitchen table doubles as a shrine, photographs propped between salt and pepper, a folded scarf that smells like a homeland. Those tactile rituals communicate, week after week, that the dead participate in daily life. If you are planning how to pass on your convictions, think about what objects you would entrust to relatives and what behaviors you want associated with them. Relational customs transmitted through food and craft operate as covert catechesis. Recipes handed down with stories about the person who first cooked them embed narratives of continuity. Quilts pieced from a parent's shirts convert grief into an object that can be touched, hugged, and displayed. A young couple I know transformed an estate of t-shirts into a blanket for their child. The act of stitching became an education in how memory can be embodied. These practices teach a theology of presence through utility, rather than through doctrinal propositions. Public gestures within a household, small annual recollections, a dedicated chair at holiday meals, a ritual toast on certain dates, establish temporal rhythms that normalize remembrance. Over decades, those rhythms shape communal expectations, which stories are told, which virtues are celebrated, and which behaviors are held up as signposts of fidelity to the departed. When households resist setting any formal marker, memory tends to fragment. When they invest in modest, repeatable habits, successors inherit a living archive of values tied to particular persons. Intergenerational transmission also depends on whether elders invite inquiry or insist on closure. Families that encourage questions, record oral histories, and explain ambiguous episodes cultivate critical engagement that allows theological beliefs about what follows death to mature. In contrast, elders who offer only platitudes or deflect uncomfortable inquiries often leave younger members with untested assumptions and unresolved anxieties. If you want your convictions to be durable and examined, create occasions for stories to be told aloud and for evidence, letters, recordings, artifacts, to be shared and discussed. Finally, intentional household projects can bridge private memory and communal practice. Simple acts, scheduling an interview with an elder, assembling a recipe and story booklet, or organizing a hands-on craft day to make keepsakes, convert passive inheritance into active formation. Now, consider which of these modest investments you can begin. The time you spend collecting a single testimony might change not only how your family mourns but also how it believes what comes next. Treat the household as a training ground for ceremonial competence rather than merely a repository of sentiment. In many families, the capacity to manage practical aspects of a farewell, navigating vendors, drafting brief remarks, or organizing visitors, lives in a few people. If you want those skills to survive, set up short apprenticeships, and elder teams with a younger relative for a single memorial, teaching how to coordinate timing, whom to notify, and which small gestures matter most. This is vocational learning. It turns ad hoc panic into practiced capability so the next generation steps forward with confidence rather than confusion. Beyond handing down tasks, consider creating a formal role with a rotating mandate, a designated custodian of stories and artifacts who keeps an orderly inventory and a short rationale for each item's significance. Make that inventory tangible and portable. Card-sized notes tucked with photographs, a labeled list kept in a family binder, so responsibility is clear when life scatters people across cities. Such simple bookkeeping reduces disputes over heirlooms and ensures that objects retain their intended function as carriers of lineage rather than becoming anonymous clutter. Silence and omission deserve intentional strategy because what is left unsaid often calcifies into myth. Families can adopt an honesty protocol that specifies age-appropriate windows for revealing certain facts, medical choices, contested histories, or legal complications, so revelation follows a plan rather than accidental leaks. Conducting 2 or 3 guided conversations over seasons, each tailored to developmental stages, helps preserve trust and lets complex realities be integrated into a coherent narrative instead of spawning rumors. Humor can perform crucial work and should not be sidelined. Shared jokes, recurring quips about a late relative's quirks, or a light-hearted ritual performed at breakfasts can re-anchor grief into a lived relationship rather than a solemn relic. Encourage playful commemorations that match the deceased's temperament, perhaps an annual informal breakfast where one person tells an absurd story and another offers a mock award. These moments validate affection through laughter and teach children that affection endures in ordinary interaction as well as in solemn ceremony. When families combine religious or cultural backgrounds, negotiation becomes a craft. Establish a short agenda before a major observance that lists non-negotiable elements for each side and items open to fusion. For instance, one household might insist on a particular reading while another requests a symbolic action. A compromise could grant time for both, sequenced so neither feels buried. Holding a pre-event council with time limits, clear roles, and a facilitator from outside the immediate family prevents emotion from derailing the rite and fosters a sense of shared authorship over the memorial form. Finally, adopt compact legacy practices that are easy to sustain. Ask each adult to write a single-page life note that summarizes values, a pivotal story, and a concrete instruction about personal effects. Store these pages where successors can find them, one copy with a trusted friend, one with a lawyer, one in the household binder. Host an occasional practice session where family members read a peer's life note aloud and offer 2 brief reflections. These exercises normalize the exchange of personal meaning and convert abstract intentions into small, repeatable acts that keep relationships alive across generations. Think of the household as a workshop where specific capabilities are forged rather than vague attitudes passed down. Start by rehearsing the spoken elements people will actually be asked to perform: a short tribute, a brief welcome, a concise thank you. Train aloud. Use timed drills, 1 minute for a memory, 3 minutes for a reflection, so speakers learn pacing and where to breathe. Now, consider how this applies when you face the moment of speaking in front of strangers. Rehearsals reduce adrenaline-driven blanks and give younger relatives a template they can replicate under stress. Communication practice should also include difficult conversations that commonly arise at the edge of life, negotiating visiting schedules, saying no to intrusive questions, or explaining why a treatment will be declined. Run structured role plays where participants switch roles so everyone experiences both asking and refusing. Provide 3 short sentence starters for safety: I can be with you for 30 minutes, I need help with this, not commentary, and we'll decide together at this day and time. These scripts offer clear boundaries that family members can use without improvising under pressure. Design the physical setting as intentionally as you plan words. Create small, atmosphere cards that list music choices, lighting levels, soft, low, window-lit, and 2 safe scents, lavender or unscented oil, and place cards in a drawer by the usual gathering spot. Run a quick rehearsal, dim the lights, play a chosen piece, and note how tone shifts. A coastal family I know practiced a simple shoreline right in their living room: sand in a glass jar, a recorded gull sound, and a 5-minute reading, so attendees could feel how sensory cues anchor memory. Practicing the environment lets hosts adjust details before urgency forces last-minute guesses. Break rituals down into modular elements so they can be combined depending on time and numbers. Build a menu with components that can be assembled like dishes at a buffet: a 1-minute lighting gesture, a 3-person memory circle, a 10-minute open sharing period, and a 5-minute closing blessing. Teach household members to mix and match these modules. That way, if only a few people can attend, the ceremony still feels complete. If dozens arrive, modules can be sequenced to sustain attention. Anticipate emotional flashpoints by creating simple pause and reset tools. Introduce a calm signal, an object placed on a table that anyone may touch to request silence, or agree on a phrase like, "Let's hold this," to stop a conversation that's escalating. Train a rotating family member in grounding techniques, slow count breathing, guiding a brief centering exercise, or offering water and a chair. These micro-interventions prevent overload and allow proceedings to continue with dignity rather than dissolve into chaos. Cultivate a household method for eliciting memorable stories that doubles as rehearsal for memorials. Use a 3-prompt technique: ask for a moment that surprised the storyteller, 1 sensory detail they still remember, and 1 lesson learned. Record short, 5-minute segments with a phone and label them with date and name. These concise testimonies supply authentic material for tributes and ease the burden on speakers who otherwise must invent a narrative under stress. Finally, normalize small, regular skill-sharpening gatherings so capability grows without fanfare. 20-minute monthly meetups where one person practices a reading and another practices guiding silence inoculate families against panic. Begin with low stakes, a neighbor's birthday toast or a pet memorial. Over time, competency becomes habit, and when a crisis arrives, members draw on practiced gestures rather than improvisation. Take this step, schedule the first brief rehearsal this month and invite 1 other person to join. The payoff is steadier presence when it will matter most. Treat the event as a staged production and assemble a compact backstage manual that lives in both print and cloud. This dossier should contain clear role assignments, contact cards with time of day availability, and ready-made templates for stage directions, where processions begin, where readers stand, how long music cues run. Think of it as a crew call sheet rather than a theological brief. It turns improvisation into coordination so that strangers who arrive to help can step into defined tasks without consulting elders in the middle of grief. Design the physical choreography with an eye toward movement patterns. Map entrances and exits on a simple floor sketch, indicate one-way corridors for steady flow, and mark fallback stations for wheelchairs or strollers. Use color-coded signs made from inexpensive card stock to route people, one color for seating, another for refreshments, and a third for private family areas. This small investment prevents bottlenecks and protects intimate moments from being interrupted by a circulating crowd. Create a volunteer toolkit that treats each helper as a specialist. An usher package should include a greeting script for newcomers, a short checklist for seating accessibility, and a procedure for escorting people to the quiet room. The audiovisual steward needs a condensed cheat sheet, a labeled chord map, a rehearsal-free cue sheet for playing tracks, and an emergency contact for the venue's technician. Meanwhile, a designated hospitality lead manages food handoff, allergy notices, and disposable serviceware. Specialization reduces anxiety and makes delegation practical. Anticipate disruptions with scenario matrices rather than ad hoc decisions. For weather, set precise numerical triggers. If attendance projections rise above X, move outdoors. If rainfall probability exceeds Y, enact Plan B. For media attention, keep a pre-approved holding statement and name the single authorized spokesperson. For sudden legal or health holds, create a rapid notification chain so key relatives and clergy receive concise updates rather than fragmented rumors. These decision rules spare grieving families from being thrust into crisis management roles. Prioritize inclusivity by building accommodations into the plan from the outset. Contract a captioning service for spoken content when possible, arrange for a certified interpreter for public rituals, and provide printed large-type programs. Design a sensory map indicating where amplified sound, bright lights, or scented flowers will be located so attendees with sensitivities can choose seating accordingly. Offer quiet childcare options with vetted caregivers who can supervise children in an adjacent, sound-dampened space. Handle public communications and consent with transparent templates. Draft a press notice, a social media advisory, and an opt-in permission form for photographs and live streaming. Specify a review period after which recorded material will be archived, and designate a steward to remove images upon family request. If financial gifts are expected, publish clear instructions for honoring the deceased, anonymity options, suggested causes, and a named trustee for donations, to prevent confusion and ensure accountability. Finish the preparation by producing a one-page day of guide that fits in a wallet or the back pocket of a program. This single sheet should list arrival times for key personnel, a two-line emergency protocol, and the location of the family's private room. Now, consider how this applies when you face a sudden loss in a cramped apartment or an unexpected overflow at a church hall. Assemble the manual, secure 2 committed volunteers for critical roles, and set the contingency thresholds in writing. Doing this work ahead of time converts chaos into calm service and preserves the dignity of the moment for everyone present. Design memorials that make space for ambivalence and repair rather than insisting on tidy closure. One practical method is to build a short, formal acknowledgement into the order of service, a 2-minute, scripted segment where witnesses name harms, losses, or unresolved questions without trying to resolve them. Appoint an impartial facilitator trained in trauma-sensitive practice to hold that moment. Their task is to keep time, offer a neutral phrase to begin, and provide a brief ritual response, such as the collective laying down of a plain cloth, that marks recognition rather than judgment. This approach transforms potential flashpoints into contained, witnessed actions so communities can register complexity without fracturing. Create living, participatory tributes that invite ongoing involvement rather than a single afternoon of attention. For example, Establish a grafted tree memorial in which each family plants a labeled scion that will be tended at an annual pruning and story day. Plan the ecology intentionally. Select hardy cultivars matched to local climate, map irrigation needs, and draft a 5-year care schedule with volunteer sign-ups. To make the memorial durable, set aside a modest maintenance fund and record stewardship responsibilities in a simple public covenant. By embedding the remembrance in seasonal labor, grief becomes a practiced stewardship rather than an archival footnote. Extend the ceremony's reach with tactile ritual kits sent ahead to absent participants so they can be co-present. A kit might include an untied ribbon, a packet of native seeds, a short scripted reading printed on heavy paper, and a small votive candle with lighting instructions. Include a one-page facilitator's note explaining pacing so remote people can sync with the in-person program without technical friction. Ship kits 2 weeks in advance, and provide low-tech alternatives, prepaid postcards or downloadable PDFs, for those who cannot receive packages. When you organize a memorial across geography, these material cues create a shared embodied tempo that transcends screens. Adopt clear editorial ethics for collective storytelling so public narratives don't erase inconvenient truths. Convene a small story council, representatives from family, close friends, and anyone significantly impacted, to set boundaries for what will be published or displayed. Use a written consent form that specifies whether submissions may be edited, anonymized, or archived indefinitely. If disagreements arise, offer a mediated redaction process. One neutral reviewer proposes language changes and the council votes on adoption. This protocol protects dignity, balances competing memories, and prevents post-event disputes from turning a memorial into courtroom material. Design short-term rituals that seed long-term community care rather than depending on a single hired organizer. Draft a one-page community agreement that names 3 rotating duties: hosting an anniversary gathering, coordinating a communal meal, and auditing the memorial's upkeep, and list who will assume each duty for the coming year. Make the covenant renewable by simple majority at the annual gathering so responsibility circulates and new people can join. Pair the agreement with a tiny contingency fund, even a modest shared account, to cover costs like plant replacement or a commemorative plaque. Small financial planning reduces the chance that memory will fade for lack of resources. Finally, convert planning into immediate, low-friction steps you can take this week. Call 3 people and propose a 30-minute meeting to brainstorm one participatory element you could add: a living tribute, a tactile kit, or a short acknowledgement segment. Draft a 40-word prompt you will use to solicit stories, and set a deadline 2 weeks out for submissions. By turning abstract ideals about dignity and complexity into concrete tasks with dates and named responsibilities, you move from good intentions to practices that hold memory alive in ways that honor both truth and care. Treat a memorial as an operative instrument of communal repair rather than a static artifact to be admired. One strategy is to link a commemorative project to an explicit program of public work. A memorial can seed a scholarship for local youth, underwrite a neighborhood safety retrofit, or fund language classes that restore access to a community's heritage. By tying remembrance to measurable improvement, the site becomes an engine for accountability and ongoing care. Imagine a plaque that not only names a loss but also points to a nearby bench bought with the memorial's small grants. Visitors leave knowing grief has been converted into tangible benefit. Consider mobile installations that bring remembrance into people's daily routes instead of requiring them to travel. Lightweight pavilions, pop-up exhibits, or touring exhibits in public buses can intersect with markets, libraries, and commuter hubs, inviting chance encounters with memory practices. These movable forms democratize access, encourage unexpected conversations across different neighborhoods, and allow the commemorative program to evolve in response to each locale's needs. If you organize such a project, think about short exhibition cycles so content stays fresh and relevant to different audiences. Invest in a cohort of trained custodians whose role is explicitly educational and administrative rather than ceremonial. These paid positions rotate annually and combine archive management, event coordination, and outreach to schools and civic groups. A small stipend fellowship gives younger members professional experience while ensuring continuity of care and a transparent chain of responsibility. This model avoids assigning the entire burden to volunteers and creates a durable link between the memorial and local institutions that can provide supervision, training, and accountability. Design a graded release strategy for personal materials that balances privacy with communal sharing. Legal custodianship can be paired with time disclosure, diaries, video testimonies, or letters may be entrusted to a neutral holder who releases them only under conditions the donor specified. Coordinate these releases with public programming so that a sealed letter opening becomes a ritual moment within an event rather than an unattended file drop. When you face choices about private archives, plan both the legal instrument and the social choreography that makes a delayed disclosure meaningful. Explore multisensory, site-responsive art as a method for sustained engagement. Commission rotating sound compositions, light sequences that shift with the seasons, or tactile pathways that invite visitors to move slowly and reflect. These interventions should be renewable, invite different composers, storytellers, and fabricators to reinterpret the space each year so the memorial remains alive to new voices. Practical control mechanisms, modular fixtures, replaceable panels, and clear maintenance protocols make innovation feasible without jeopardizing long-term upkeep. Finally, adopt a simple governance and assessment framework that makes stewardship legible over time. Establish a concise charter with renewal intervals, set 3 annual benchmarks: physical condition, participation diversity, and financial sufficiency, and publish a brief public report. Integrate a modest contingency fund with explicit draw rules so care persists during lean periods. Regularly solicit structured feedback from visitors and partners and let those responses guide program pivots. Now, consider how this applies when you have limited resources. Prioritize one movable piece, fund a single fellowship for a year, and draft a short charter with 2 measurable goals. These narrow steps turn aspiration into executable policy and protect memory through practical design. Equip leaders with concrete rhetorical tools that honor biblical complexity while avoiding doctrinal overreach. Begin by teaching a graded set of opening lines for public addresses, phrases that acknowledge uncertainty, name the biblical source being read, and set a scope for claims the speaker will make. Instead of asserting definitive metaphysical outcomes, use calibrated language that places a text within its literary context and then offers one interpretive possibility alongside others. This keeps sermons intellectually honest and emotionally stabilizing without stripping them of pastoral warmth. A concise model might pair a brief historical note, a plain language paraphrase, and a clearly labeled pastoral application so listeners know which element is scripture, which is interpretation, and which is encouragement. Adopt participatory homiletics so congregations do theological work together rather than having answers handed down. Short, guided breakout moments within a service invite small groups to reflect on a text's emotional resonance, to name what unsettles them, and to propose how it might shape their care for the dying. These micro-discussions can be scaffolded with 3 focused prompts and strict time limits so they fit liturgical rhythms. By making interpretation communal, leaders distribute responsibility for meaning and reduce the pressure on any single speaker to resolve ancient ambiguities on the spot. Revise liturgical language to open rather than close interpretive space. Draft alternative collects, responses, and committal phrases that emphasize relationship, memory, and future responsibility without guaranteeing specific postmortem states. Offer a short menu of options a family can choose from, some texts that dwell on continuity of love, others that highlight hope for renewal, and a few that simply commend the deceased to God's mercy. Training worship planners to treat words as gifts, not assertions, makes services hospitable to plural theological convictions within one congregation. Develop a set of pastoral conversation scripts for bedside visits and hospice consultations. Design these scripts around three predictable needs: affirmation of presence, limits of knowledge, and practical next steps. Provide ready-made sentences that convey comfort without promising metaphysical knowledge, phrases that validate grief, invite memory sharing, and outline immediate logistics. Role-play these scripts in clergy training sessions so ministers can deliver them with natural cadence rather than sounding rehearsed. Practice reduces the temptation to fill silence with premature certainty. Create interprofessional learning modules that pair theology students with counselors, ethicists, and palliative practitioners for supervised clinical encounters. In these modules, theology students learn how medical realities alter the questions families ask and how language must adapt. The encounters should include debriefs focused on how certain phrasings performed emotionally and legally, and they should catalog what worked across cultural differences. This produces leaders who can navigate institutional constraints while keeping theological integrity. Design curricula for multigenerational faith formation that treat death as an ongoing vocation rather than a one-time dogmatic quiz. Use storytelling labs where youth craft short testimonies about elders' lives, followed by reflective prompts that ask what particular texts mean for how we live now. Embed simple liturgical acts, lighting a shared candle each month, composing one-sentence remembrances, that cultivate habits of attention and theological humility. These practices train younger people to live with questions rather than rush to premature certainties. Now, consider how this applies when you must lead a service for someone whose family holds divergent beliefs. Prepare at least 2 brief, mutually respectful script options in advance, invite a family representative into planning, and commit to language that names the plurality rather than erasing it. Adopting these communicative practices equips leaders to shepherd communities with clarity and compassion in the face of biblical ambiguity. Reflecting on this journey so far, you may notice a pattern not of neat conclusions but of intersecting pressures that reshape how meaning is made. Picture a geological fold where layers of rock, each formed under different conditions, bend and press against one another until a new ridge emerges. The questions we carry about what follows death are formed in a similar crucible: textual currents, habit, public institutions, technological change, and intimate practice all pressed together, producing contours that neither source alone could have foreseen. That composite landscape conditions expectation more powerfully than any single argument or image because it organizes experience before formal doctrines are even consulted. There is an economy at work in which language, ritual, and material practice exchange value. Words that once served narrow functions become currency in public-facing scripts. Gestures that began as local techniques migrate into shared repertoires. Technological affordances reconfigure possibility and thus the grammar of consolation. When these elements trade roles, they also redistribute authority. Authority migrates from abstract claims to situated practices, from expert declarations to those who steward memory in everyday settings. You feel this shift whenever an ordinary arrangement carries more persuasive weight than an abstract assertion. Practice becomes the default interpreter of meaning. This dynamic also invites a reassessment of responsibility. Holding beliefs about ultimate things is no longer only the province of scholars or clergy. It is a communal craft enacted across households, civic structures, and professional networks. Such distributed responsibility requires different competencies, not merely the ability to argue well, but the capacity to listen across difference, to design rites that tolerate uncertainty, and to build logistical frameworks that honor vulnerability. These competencies are ethical in form as much as technical, shaping how people are accompanied and how collective memory is curated. Notice too how contingency has become a central category. Unpredictability, whether from sudden change, contested claims, or emergent technologies, means that durable answers are less important than adaptable practices. A resilient approach does not demand certainty about final states. It privileges care, clarity in the present, and mechanisms for revising arrangements as contexts shift. This pragmatism is not a retreat from depth, rather, it is a reframing that keeps moral imagination alive under conditions of ambiguity. You are asked to steward what you value in ways that can bend without breaking. Finally, there is an invitation implicit in the whole apparatus, to inhabit ambiguity with purpose. The work ahead is not merely intellectual housekeeping but creative formation. It asks that communal life be designed so memory is generative, not merely preservative, that rituals be crafted to hold contradictions, that legal and institutional scaffolding be used to protect, not to ossify. This posture calls for imaginative courage and careful planning, for practices that make room for grief, for critique, and for hope without collapsing one into the other. As we pivot toward the closing reflection, take with you this image of a living archive, flexible, contested, and tender, one that depends less on final answers than on the quality of how we prepare, name, and accompany. The next segment will draw out what it means to act in that space, how commitments can be articulated without foreclosing doubt, how communities can build forms that endure, and how personal decisions can be aligned with public realities. Keep in view the central aim, to move from inherited pictures toward practices that sustain human flourishing when certainty is unavailable. What emerges from this exploration is less a final map than an invitation to a new kind of attention. The texts we revere, the rituals we inherit, the laws that govern funeral practice, and the technologies that archive life do not simply tell us what happens after death, they shape how we live toward death. That shaping is neither neutral nor accidental. It carries moral weight, distributes authority, and conditions how communities hold one another when certainty dissolves. The central insight is not a metaphysical answer but a practical proposition. If our pictures of the beyond will influence care, grief, and civic life, then the most consequential work is the present one, how we prepare words, structures, and habits that will meet the living and the dying with honesty and dignity. This preparation asks us to become custodians of nuance. Holding ambiguity responsibly means designing public forms that permit doubt and practice that make room for sorrow without collapsing into platitude. It requires legal savvy to translate convictions into enforceable wishes, liturgical imagination to craft ceremonies that do not erase disagreement, and domestic courage to teach children not tidy answers but steady practices. These competencies are not abstract virtues, they are concrete skills you can cultivate. A family notebook, a rehearsed memorial module, a clearly worded advance directive, each small artifact reroutes the powerful energy of narrative and institution toward care rather than confusion. Equally important is who we authorize to interpret the end. Authority has shifted from isolated doctrinal pronouncements to distributed practices across households, hospitals, and civic spaces. That shift is an opportunity when it is accompanied by training, mutual respect, and shared protocols. Clergy, clinicians, legal advisors, and lay custodians can collaborate to create predictable, humane responses when crisis arrives. Such collaboration preserves theological integrity without surrendering pastoral presence to administrative chaos. The real measure of faith in this compressed, plural world is whether it produces practices that sustain people through both legal limbo and private grief. There is also an ethical imperative woven through technological change and popular narrative. Do we let marketable images and platform policies define what continuity looks like, or do we steward memory with intentional moral imagination? Digital heirs, genetic traces, and online memorials can be instruments of consolation or sources of harm depending on the commitments we encode now. Choosing thoughtfully about what to preserve, how to authorize access, and which stories to amplify shapes communal memory in ways that outlast any single life. Such choices are a form of devotion, not merely to belief about what follows, but to how presence is constituted in the living world. The true practice begins now. This is not a sentimental injunction but a pragmatic charge. Prepare documents, rehearse rituals, name stewards, and have the conversations that transform anxiety into action. Do so not out of fear of death but out of regard for those who will grieve. When communities learn to plan with humility, acknowledging limits, protecting dignity, and committing to cooperation, they create a moral architecture that honors life by how it meets its ending. In that architecture, the deepest question about what happens after death is answered most faithfully not by certainty about a distant realm but by the quality of care we give each other in this present hour.